How did those old guys stand themselves? He had only gone 2 weeks without washing, and he wanted to drop-kick himself into the nearest bathtub. Sighing, Edward got out of bed. He needed to take a shower. When Edward returned to his bedroom after a very long, very hot, very soapy shower, the contrast between his newly washed state and the smell of the stale air in his room was more than he could stand. He picked his way around all the cascading mountains of books to get to his window. Opening the shade let in so much sun that his eyes watered, so he only left the shade open long enough to lift the window. Then he pulled the shade again. He wanted fresh air. He wasn't ready for light. A warm breeze caught the vinyl shade and flicked it back and forth against the window frame, causing a whoosh click every few minutes. Edward ignored the sound and looked around his room. How many hours had Edward and Jack spent in this room? Maybe he should sit down and calculate that. Reading science fiction didn't seem to be enough to distract his mind from the nightmare he was replaying. Maybe a complicated math problem would do the trick. Edward crossed to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a pad of paper, a pencil, and his calculator. He looked at the edges of his antique walnut desk. His mom had bought that desk for him when he and Jack had started junior high. Jack had been jealous of it because it was so big. Jack's desk was a spindly thing made up of particle board covered with wood veneer. He said it didn't nurture his brain cells, so Edward had let Jack use his desk most afternoons. Jack had done a lot of his homework in the previous 2 years at this desk. Edward had done his on his bed. Edward wiped his eyes and turned away from the desk. He needed to add more dishes to the pile so he could barely see the desk at all. He set down the paper, pencil, and calculator on his bed, piled more dishes on the desk, and turned away from those memories. He wandered over to his shelves. Only a few books remained there, his least favorites. They lay limply in the layers of dust that had hidden behind the other books. He sighed and returned to his bed. Plopping on the bed, he picked up his pad of paper. Okay, how many hours was Jack in this room? Before they rescued Faraday, he and Jack had split their time pretty equally between Jack's room and his, so all he had to do was figure out the total hours they had spent together and divide it in half. He began to try to find his earliest memory of Jack. That was easy. It was right after Christmas. When he was only 2, Edward's dad had gotten him a large and a huge set of building blocks, so he and Jack had built a massive castle. Then Edward decided to be a dragon. He threw his arms out to create dragon wings, and he flung his hand into one of the uppermost blocks. This started a slow-motion disintegration of all their efforts. In a matter of seconds, the blocks went from castle to a pile of rubble. As it did, Jack threw up his little arms, smiled, and shouted, "Earthquake!" Edward felt something drip from his chin, and he realized he was crying. He dropped his pad of paper and wiped his eyes. This wasn't working. He couldn't tally up the hours he and Jack were together without remembering the times they had shared. He wasn't ready to do that. He looked at his empty shelves again. He needed more books. But to get them, he'd have to go to the library. Forget that. He wasn't leaving the house. That left him with the TV. Edward sighed, exited his room, and went down the hall to the living room at the front of the house. The living room smelled like the lemon dusting spray his mom used. That wasn't bad. It was better than the smell of his bedroom. The problem with the living room was that it was too bright. The blue sky day outside the house was shoving its way into the room. Edward shrank back into the hall as he watched some kids in the street bike past. He winced at the sound of a car whooshing by. That was the sound he wished he never had to hear again. Edward thought about returning to his room, but too many memories and not enough books waited for him there. The TV was his only hope for continued sanity. Taking a deep breath, Edward crossed the rug to the beige sofa that sat under a picture window. The window's drapes were open. He crossed to the drawstring and pulled the drapes closed. The heavy maroon drapes were thermal, room darkening, so once he had closed them, the room was like a cave. Not only was the light blocked out, the outside sounds were muted. That was better. Edward plopped onto the sofa and grabbed the remote. After a few minutes of channel surfing, Edward settled on an episode of an old sci-fi series, which thankfully held his attention until the commercial. When a commercial for some amazing cleaning product came on, he muted the TV and thought about getting up to get a bag of chips from the kitchen. He started to stand, but then the cleaning product ad disappeared and a new one took over the screen. On a black and white checkerboard backdrop, big red words flashed across the screen. Grieving the loss of a beloved pet? Edward froze and stared at the TV. The image of a large, cartoonish bear wearing a top hat filled the screen. The bear was talking. Edward quickly unmuted the TV as the words, Fazbear Entertainment presents Fazbear Friendly Faces scrolled beneath the bear. Just send in a few strands of hair from your lost pet, and let Fazbear Entertainment do the rest. We can use your pet's DNA to craft a face that looks exactly like your beloved furry friend. The face is then integrated onto an animatronic body to create a loyal pet that will follow you around forever. The image on the screen shifted to an example of the friendly face, and Edward watched in awe as a robotic orange cat romped around after the red dot of a laser pointer. What a small price to pay to feel joy again, rather than wallow in those sad feelings of loss and longing. The bear looked like he was talking directly to Edward, and Edward could feel the intensity of the bear's cool blue eyes. On the screen, more red writing flashed. For a limited time only. An amazing deal, just for you. The bear started talking again. And if you order within the next 30 minutes, you'll get free shipping. A price streaked across the screen. It was a lot, at least for Edward, but he thought he had enough in his savings stash. The bear leaned forward, making his communication feel even more personal, almost intimate. If you don't love your friendly face, the bear said, then my name isn't Freddy Fazbear. The bear leaned back and smiled, flashing a wide mouthful of teeth. It pointed at its chest. And I am Freddy Fazbear, so you're guaranteed to be thrilled with your new faithful friend. The robotic cat reappeared on the screen, and Freddy's voiceover said, What better way to memorize a precious friend than with a new pal? Someone who will remind you of the memories you made with your pet while helping you make new ones together. Why settle for an urn full of ash? Jeez, I'm really sucking at this. Why settle for an urn full of ashes or a photo on the wall, when you can have a memorial you can play with, one who will keep you company anytime you want? More red letters erupted onto the screen. Get your friendly face today. Call now. Call now faded out, to be replaced by a large red phone number. Edward looked around wildly for something to write on. Of course, there was nothing. His mother kept the living room too neat. Frantically, he read the phone number twice. Then he began chanting the numbers in his head. He got up and ran to the kitchen. He grabbed the notepad his mom kept next to the phone. As he pulled it towards him, he knocked the phone off the counter. He didn't even try to grab it. It hit the floor with a crack as he scribbled down the number before he forgot it. Edward pulled out one of the chairs from under the kitchen table. He sat and stared at the phone number in the living room. A woman screamed on the TV. The sci-fi show was back on. He didn't care. If this worked out, he wouldn't need escapism anymore. He smiled at the phone number. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a monster was trying to squeeze the heart out of Edward's chest. He suddenly saw a sliver of hope for his future. Maybe he could have a friend after all. Edward nodded to himself. He was going to order a friendly face, and then it would be kind of like Jack was still here. As long as Edward had a robotic Faraday, he could pretend his friend was around. He stood and reached for the phone. It wasn't there. Oh, right, he muttered. He looked down at the floor and grimaced. The phone had a crack in the receiver. His mother wasn't going to be happy with him. He turned the phone on and heard the dial tone. Well, at least it still worked. Edward smiled and punched in the number he had written down. By the time Edward had talked to the nice lady at Fazbear Entertainment and was given the address to which he should send his money and the hair of his lost pet, it was mid-afternoon. He needed to get moving. Now he was pedaling his bike along the sidewalk, just a few houses down from Jack's house. He had a lump in his throat, and the closer he got to the two-story brick house where his friend had lived, the bigger the lump got. Jack Street was only a couple blocks from Edward's. Like the street Edward lived on, Jack Street was lined with a mix of older homes that ranged from quiet craftsman cottages, like the one Edward and his mom lived in, to big Tudor and tall Victorian places. All the homes were guarded by ancient oak and walnut trees, some fronted by tall hedges, others had a picket or wrought iron fences. If only Jack's house had a fence. The street was pretty quiet. Edward heard a few little kids squealing from behind one of the houses. In the distance, a radio played an upbeat pop tune. The music felt all wrong. It should have been slow and dark, something in a minor key. When Edward reached the corner right before Jack's house, he stopped his bike and leaned it against the massive trunk of an oak tree in the yard next to Jack's. He stood on shaky legs and swallowed hard before he looked at the street. The street was empty, but in Edward's mind, it wasn't. He began to breathe heavily. What was in Edward's mind got bigger and brighter, and suddenly it seemed to jump out of his head and explode into the street, as if he was watching the whole scene over again, in real time. There was Faraday, gleefully battling at the butterfly. There was Jack, his face stretched into a contorted expression of dread. There was the truck. Edward leaned over and concentrated on breathing. He had to get this over with. Straightening, Edward darted out into the street. He didn't even look for cars. He realized after he was in the street, he just ran. He trotted to the place where Jack and Faraday lay. He could see them there. It was a weird projection from his mind, he knew, but they looked real, disturbingly real. Because he could see them, he knew exactly where to find them. To find some of Faraday's fur. When he got there, though, he realized he wouldn't have needed his mind's upsetting reenactment. A blood stain marked the spot of Jack's and Faraday's last seconds on Earth. When Edward saw it, he had to clamp his mouth shut to keep from spewing what was left of his undigested soup all over the street. Wanting this over with, Edward spastically scanned the area around the bloodstain for black hair. Finally, he spotted some lying at the end of the rust-colored splotch. Pulling a plastic bag from his pocket, Edward quickly leaned over, plucked the hair from the road, and dropped it into the bag. Then he ran back to his bike, jumped on, and pedaled away as fast as he could. He was home just a few minutes later, tearing into his house. Edward slammed the door and leaned against it, panting. Okay, that was the hard part done. The hard part is done. Just 2 more things to do, and they're easy. Edward hurried into his mother's home office, perfectly neat and decorated in creams and pale blues. He went to the pine storage armoire to the corner of the room and dug inside for a padded envelope and some stamps. He took both of these back to the kitchen and put his money and the plastic bag of Faraday's hair inside the envelope. He added the right postage, and after checking the time, he went back outside to his bike and headed to the post office. The lady at Fazbear Entertainment had told Edward it would take 8 weeks for his friendly face to get to him. 8 weeks? That was a long time, but it was better than being forever without Faraday and Jack. Of course, he knew that his friendly face could not and would not replace Jack and Faraday, but he believed that having an animated reminder of the kitten that his best friend had so loved would help him start wanting to live again. Because right now, he really didn't care too much about his life. Edward marked his calendar with the approximate date on which he expected his friendly face to arrive, August 28th. Every day, he crossed out a square and told himself he was one step closer to having what he was waiting for. The summer was long and lonely. Edward's mother suggested that he go to a camp, but he flatly refused. She threatened to put him in summer school. "You like to learn," she coaxed. He shook his head. "If you enroll me, I'll run away from home." "I'll find you if you do that." "I read a lot, Mom," Edward said. "I've read a lot about going off the grid, too. I won't be easy to locate." His mother just shook her head and went to work. When Edward's mother began talking about moving to a different town for a fresh start, Edward realized he'd better do something to prevent such a drastic action. "Will you take me to the library tomorrow to get some books?" he asked her over a Saturday and Sunday breakfast of overcooked French toast. His mom wasn't stellar in the kitchen, but most of what she said was edible. "Sure," she said. The eagerness in her voice made him feel bad. She was thinking that he was snapping out of it. He wasn't. Day after day crawled by. Finally, August 28 came. And went. No package. Edward called Fazbear Entertainment. "Where's my friendly face?" He asked another nice lady on the phone. "Could you give me your name, dear?" "Edward Coulter." He listened to the keyboard clicking through the phone line. "Here you are," she sang out after a moment. "There was a delay in manufacturing because of a production anomaly. We're so sorry for your inconvenience, but you should have your friendly face in about 2 weeks. We'll include a discount coupon for another Fazbear Entertainment order as an apology for the delay." Edward sighed. He didn't want any other Fazbear Entertainment stuff. He wanted his robotic Faraday. Now, he was having to go back to school before his animatronic cat arrived. Somehow that made returning to school even more depressing than it already was. But what could he do except wait? So he waited. 2 weeks into his new school year. 2 weeks of being studiously avoided by every one of his classmates. 2 weeks of being babied by the high school teachers who had been informed of May's tragedy, and Edward was trying to get used to being a freshman without his friend by his side. Every day was an exercise in endurance, just getting through the long hours until he could go home and check his mail. Finally, on a Monday afternoon, he arrived home to find a package waiting for him on the front porch. "Yes!" he shouted before snatching it up and taking it inside. Edward dropped his backpack on the floor right inside the door. His mom hated when he did that, but he'd pick it up later. He ran into the kitchen with his package, setting the big cardboard box with the Fazbear Entertainment logo on the counter. Edward hurried to the knife box by the stove and pulled out a paring knife. A gust of wind outside rattled the small paned window over the sink. He glanced out. The black clouds he noticed overhead during his bus ride home from school were churning low in the sky. They were in for a storm. He didn't care. Turning his back on the window, he returned to the kitchen table. Outside, a dog barked incessantly, almost frenziedly. So much that if Edward hadn't been in a hurry to open his package, he'd have checked on it. Other than the crazy dog, it was quiet. The only sound inside the house was the low hum of the refrigerator. Edward began carefully slicing along the seal of the Fazbear Entertainment box. The seal was black and white checked, like the background in the commercial he'd seen. It had Freddy Fazbear stickers spaced every few inches as well. He felt kind of bad slicing through Freddy's toothy smile. The knife made a chuffing sound as it sawed through the cardboard. Edward's breath came in excited little gasps that joined the knife's rhythm. Edward didn't bother to cut the tape at the ends of the box. He just grabbed both sides of the lid and yanked, tearing the tape with a snap. Taking a deep breath, he flipped back the lid and started digging through the styrofoam peanuts that covered his prize. The peanuts flew as he reached through them. They snowed all over the table and the floor. Edward ignored them, and also the small instruction booklet that he found in the peanuts. He could see black hair on the body of a medium-sized cat. He was almost shaking in anticipation of meeting his new robotic pal. Digging out more styrofoam, he got a grip on his new friendly face. Then he pulled it from the box in a spray of more peanuts that skittered this way and that. Edward lifted the friendly face from the box and held it before his eyes. Edward screamed and dropped that on the friendly face. It landed on its legs in the open box, and the styrofoam peanuts held it upright before Edward's appalled gaze. He staggered a couple steps back into the table, and from the table. What had he done? Edward could hear his mother's voice in his head. "Edward, you have to be more careful." How many times had she told him that his single-minded focus would get him in trouble? How many accidents had he had to clean up because he wasn't thinking about what he was doing? How many times had he messed up in school, making him the butt of endless jokes? The day Edward had shot into the street to pluck hair from the pavement, the only thing he'd been thinking about was being done with his disgusting task, so he could send off his order for his friendly face. He hadn't been really looking at what he was doing. He hadn't examined the hair he had gathered to make sure it was cat hair. He just scraped up the first black hair he'd seen and he'd taken off. And this is what he got for it. Sitting in front of Edward, perched on top of a mound of styrofoam peanuts, like a deformed king, the body of a robotic cat was attached to the stiff, powder-white face of Jack. Not Faraday, Jack. Instead of Faraday's sweet, furry face, the face Edward had expected to see when he opened the box, the human hairs Edward had sent in had resulted in the stark white mold of a dead-looking human face. Jack's face, on the hard material. Jack's brown eyes were motionless, but they appeared to be gazing intelligently at Edward, just waiting for Edward to say something so Jack could reply with his usual affected display of esoteric knowledge. Edward struggled to breathe as he stared at Jack's slightly flat nose, thick lips turned up in a smile, and his broad chin. These were Jack's features, attached to an animatronic cat. It was an abomination. Edward felt sick. Using the back of his hand to knock the friendly face out of the way, Edward dumped the remainder of styrofoam peanuts from the box. He looked at the empty box and the thing that was part his friend and part cat robot. Then he wildly surveyed the kitchen, spotting a wooden spoon in the pottery jar by the stove, which his mother used for cooking utensils. He rushed over and grabbed it. He then picked up the box and held its opening level with the kitchen table. He used the spoon to shove the awful, creature? Machine? Into the box. Sorry, I paused here. It's just I accidentally, I guess, to explain, lost track. Into the box. He knew he was acting crazy, but he didn't want to touch the thing. It was just too creepy. Too wrong. Once he got the nasty friendly face in the box, he pushed the instruction manual into the box as well. He didn't even want to look at the manual. He had no intention of activating this thing. He looked around again. He had to get rid of it. He didn't want to just throw it away. First, if he did that, his mom could find it. Second, the garbage was far too easy to get out of. Edward gasped and took 2 steps away from the table. Why had he just thought of that? He shook his head. He didn't want to ponder the morbid place from which that thought had arisen. He had read way too many horror stories and science fiction novels, watched too many macabre movies. He was being ridiculous, of course, but he still wasn't going to throw this thing in the trash. No, he was going to bury it. Outside, thunder rumbled. He glanced out the window. The sky was still roiling. He'd have to hurry, grabbing the box, taking care not to touch what was inside. Edward hurried out the back of the door of the kitchen. He scurried to the garden shed at the rear end of the yard. With fumbling fingers, he turned the dial of the combination lock. It took 3 tries before he got the number to line up right so he could get the lock open. Finally, he was able to get into the shed. He grabbed a shovel and trotted to the perimeter of the yard, right up against the fence at the edge of the property. If he could have taken the friendly face someplace off his property, he would have. He wanted it far away, but he needed the thing buried now. He had no way to transport it, and even if he did, the storm's clouds were about to release their burden. He didn't really want to be outside in a thunderstorm, so he started digging. He had dug a 2-foot diameter hole about a foot down when he saw a streak of lightning out of the corner of his eye. Even though his hands smarted, he dug even faster. In only a few more minutes, he had the hole deep enough. Running back to the deck, Edward grabbed the box, then returned, even faster, to the hole he dug. The skies overhead grumbled loudly. A drop of rain landed on his nose. Edward dumped the contents of the box into the hole. The manual hit the dirt first. The friendly face landed on the manual, face up. Edward groaned when the rigid version of his friend's smiling features looked up at him. He tossed aside the box and began shoveling dirt into the hole at a breakneck pace. Every clod of dirt that hit the Jack's face made him flinch. He felt like he was burying his friend alive. He could have sworn the Jack face, though wearing Jack's non-stop smile, looked accusatory. Ignoring the condemnation in the fake Jack face, Edward shoveled until the white was obscured and finally covered completely, stomping down the dirt once he had it all over the hole. He wasn't happy with the slight mound that was left, but he hoped the rain might pound the dirt down enough for it to settle in and around the friendly face. A couple more drops hit Edward. With sore, dirty hands, he grabbed the empty box and the shovel. He darted into the shed, put the shovel where it belonged, and tucked the box behind a few other empty boxes his mother saved. Just in case, he'd get rid of it later. He barely got the door closed, and the lock clicked into place before the rain started coming down in heavy sheets. By the time he was back in the kitchen, he was soaked. When he went inside, he left mud and water all over the kitchen floor. He glanced at the clock over the phone. He had just an hour before his mom would be home. He had to hurry if he was going to dispose of the styrofoam peanuts and clean up the floor before she got here. Even though Edward was now 13, his mom still came into his room to kiss him goodnight. That usually bugged him, but tonight, her fussing was welcomed. Edward was so rattled by the awful friendly face that he was having trouble slowing his breath. The weather wasn't helping. Outside his window, the storm that had begun just as he finished burying the Jack-Cat robot thing was now slamming into the house like an army storming a castle. Every clap of thunder sounded like the thwack of a catapult being loosened upon a fortress. Every blanket of rain that rattled against the side of the house sounded like a spray of arrows, beating down on the poor, beleaguered inhabitants of the stronghold. That was how Edward saw himself and his mother. Two defenseless commoners huddled against the onslaught of the enemy, unable to defend themselves. All evening, Edward recoiled every time the thunder boomed. After the third time, he pulled into himself, like a turtle hiding in its shell. His mom said, "Edward, what in the world? You've never been afraid of thunder before." "It's not the thunder," he said. "Then what is it?" Her hair was down for the evening. It hung around her face, making her look much younger and friendlier than she did when she had it up for work. She peered at him, as if she could figure out what was going on with him by looking hard enough. He shook his head. "It's nothing. I'm just being weird." "You're not weird," his mom said. Edward laughed. "I thought you lawyers had some code that didn't let you lie." His mom smiled. "That's true, but I'm allowed to bend the truth a bit. You're not weird. You're unique." Edward laughed again. Then the rain pummeled the windows once more. He jumped up. "I think I'll go to bed early." Now, at his bedside, his mom felt his forehead. "You feel a little hot. You might have a fever. Maybe that's why the storm is bothering you this evening." Edward shrugged. Maybe. It wasn't exactly a lie. He just might have a fever, and it could have been adding to the trepidation that sat on his chest like a gargoyle. "Do you want me to take your temperature?" his mom asked. "I'm not a baby," Edward said. "I can take it myself, but I'd rather go to sleep now." His mom pressed her lips together, then nodded. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. "I love you, kiddo." "I love you too, Mom." His mom gave him one last look, walked to the door, turned off the light, and left the room. Edward wasn't ready to close his eyes, so he blinked and let his eyes adjust to the near dark. As soon as they did, he could make out the various items in his room. Enough light came in under the door from the hallway to illuminate the outline of his desk, still mostly buried under a pile of clothes he refused to move, and the sharp contours of his shelves. A small nightlight on the other side of the room cast a glow that lit up his bulletin board, just enough to remind him of the photos he still couldn't bring himself to look at, nor take down. Edward felt as stiff as a corpse. He groaned. Now why did he have to compare himself to a corpse? What was wrong with him? Why was he letting the friendly face bother him so much? It was just a stupid toy that went wrong. He shuddered and pulled the covers up to his chin. Or was it? The problem was it wasn't just a toy. It was something designed to be animated. something that contained his dead friend's DNA. He didn't want to think about the 1,001 ways that could be bad. Stop it, Edward hissed at himself. He needed an imaginotomy, or whatever they might call if one's imagination could be cut away from a person's mind. His was way too sinister tonight. Edward forced himself to close his eyes. He concentrated on a logic problem from math class, and eventually he relaxed enough to fall asleep. Edward sat up in his bed. He was perfectly still. He listened. Something had awakened him. But what? Outside, rain still drummed on the roof. The thunder was so loud and so powerful that each reverberation made the house shake. Was that what had yanked him out of sleep? He frowned and kept listening. He didn't think so. The sound that disturbed him hadn't been an ordinary sound, and it hadn't been a loud sound. It had been a subtle sound, a sinuous and sly sort of sound, something like a pattering, but not a friendly pattering like the rain. Edward reached over and turned on the small brass lamp that sat on his oak nightstand. As soon as he rotated the switch, a bolt of lightning lit up the shade, pulled over his window, and his nightstand light went out. So did the nightlight. The storm had taken out the power. Great. That was just great. Edward felt around in the dark and pulled open his nightstand drawer. He grabbed his flashlight and turned it on, hesitating to see if he could talk himself out of believing he'd heard something. When I phrased it, it sounded like I put a pause to it. When no, it's one continuous sentence, and then when it says something, it's a pause. And I don't know why I had to drag that out to explain it. Edward failed to do so and forced himself to get out of bed. He listened intently, concentrating on peeling back the auditory layers of the storm so he could hear whatever was sulking under those more assertive sounds. What had he heard? Edward shone his light this way and that as he crossed his room. Nothing was out of place. When he reached his door, he cautiously opened it. He peered out and pointed the beam of his flashlight down the hallway. The hall was empty. Edward tiptoed down the hall and aimed his flashlight into the living room. It looked perfectly normal. From behind his mom's closed door, he heard snoring. She was a heavy sleeper. Edward continued his tour of the house, checking in his mom's home office, in the bathroom, and in the kitchen. Nothing was out of place. He returned to his room, got in bed, and turned out his flashlight. As soon as he lay his head back on the pillow, he heard a creak. Edward stiffened. Had he imagined that? If he had imagined it, did it mean something was in the house? Something? Why did he think something? Wouldn't it be more reasonable to think someone? Reasonable, sure. Accurate, he didn't think so. He waited, again trying to listen past the storm. A faint scrape came from outside his door. Edward flipped on his flashlight again. He shined it at the door, spotlighting the doorknob. All the slowly turning doorknob scenes in every creepy movie he'd ever watched started running through his mind. And by the time he had gone through just a few of them, he could have sworn his doorknob was turning as well. But was it? Wanting nothing more than to hide under his bed, close his eyes, and cover his ears, Edward took a deep breath and threw back the covers, keeping his gaze on the doorknob, which didn't seem to be moving at all. Did it? He crept across his room, leaned against his door, and listened. Rain continued to batter the house. Between blasts of wind, thunder detonated, always just a second or so after the room blazed bright for an instant. The lightning was hitting close by, between the rain's thrums and the thunder's bellows. Edward had trouble picking out any other sounds. But wait, there. What was that? He frowned, pushed harder against the door, and concentrated. Had he imagined that sound? No, there it was again. It was a chittering sound, something like metal tapping on wood, only really fast, or like marbles cascading down a metal tube. What was that? Edward gripped his flashlight hard and opened his door. His flashlight was pretty bright, 2,400 lumens, so he was able to brighten the entire hall when he aimed the light straight ahead. The hall was, as it had been before, empty. He swung the light toward the opening to the living room. Shadows from beyond the opening hunched in wait for him. He listened for another few seconds, and when he heard the sound again, was it more skittering than chittering? He tentatively moved toward the living room. As he went, his light and his head swiveled this way and that. Why couldn't he tell where the sound was coming from? It had to be the storm. The cacophony outside was disrupting his ear's ability to pinpoint the direction for 1 second. He thought the sound was coming for 1 second. He thought the sound was coming from behind his mother's door, but no. That was just another bed creaking, and that was just her bed creaking when she turned over in her sleep. He was pretty sure. The next second, he thought the sound originated in the living room, but when he stepped into that room and shone his light right and left and center, he saw nothing out of place. Then he heard the sound again, and it seemed to be coming from just inside the back door. He slunk into the kitchen, then quickly aimed his light at the door. It was closed tight, the deadbolt in the right position. He heard a click and shot his light to the left. Nothing. It must have been the refrigerator. Shaking his head at his paranoia, Edward muttered, "Just go back to bed and make like an opossum, would you?" As he retreated back to his room, retracing his steps through the living room, his light still spastically searching for the source of the odd sounds, he'd idly wondered whether opossums had overreactive imaginations like his. This nonsensical query gave him a few seconds of relief from the tension turning his muscles into coils, ready to snap at just the slightest. A pff, pff, pff came from right behind him. Edward whirled. His light jittered into every inky crevice of the living room. It found nothing unusual. By now, Edward's breath was coming in little puffs. He was just one more sound away from screaming his head off. He couldn't take this much longer. Edward scuttled down the hall, dashed into his room, and yanked the doors shut behind him. He pointed the flashlight all over his room. It was just as he left it. "You're an idiot," Edward told himself. He'd strode to his bed, dove in, and pulled up the covers. His flashlight had a broad base, so he could set it upright. He did that, then lay back and stared at the disoriented circle of light splayed out over his ceiling. The flashlight's beam hit his small ceiling fan and contorted it into a many-tentacle cephalopod. That kind of freaked him out, but he wasn't about to turn out the flashlight. Nope, no way. Edward focused on the outer edges of the light above him. Above, another gust of wind hit the house with a whoomp, and more rain sprayed his window. Then, the rain and wind hushed for just an instant. In that instant, Edward heard tapping. Clear, distinctive tapping. It sounded like a small animal prancing down the hall. This time, Edward didn't hesitate. He leaped from his bed, grabbed his flashlight, strode to the door, and threw it open. He aimed his flashlight at the door, sure he was going to light up whatever was approaching his room. Nothing was in the hallway. Outside, the storm's decibel level went back up. The opening to the living room brightened as lightning speared the night again. Thunder roared before the living room even had time to return to its gloom. The wind picked up, and it shrieked around the house. It sounded like angry banshees were descending on the house in abject fury. But even through all that clamor, Edward heard another sound. This time, it was a ticking sound, but not a regular ticking sound like a clock. Tick, 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 tick. The last 5 ticks came very fast, and then nothing but the storm. Edward felt like he was going to cry. He couldn't remember ever being this scared. Well, except for those few seconds before Jack and Faraday. Edward moaned and turned to run back into his room. He slammed his door behind him, not caring whether it woke up his mom, even secretly hoping it did wake her. He wouldn't have admitted it to anyone, but he wanted his mommy. Badly. Edward jumped back into his bed, literally, and curled up in a ball under the covers. He held his flashlight to his chest, cradling it like a teddy bear. If only he had a teddy bear. Edward rolled onto his back and concentrated on calming his retching breath. "You're making it all up," he told himself. "It's all in your head." He needed a distraction from his out-of-control evil fantasy world. He decided to use what had worked for him in the past. He would recite pi. Out loud, Edward began. 3.14159265358. His heart rate began to slow. His muscles started to relax. He stopped reciting, put his thumb on the flashlight switch, and, resolved, turned it off. He kept the flashlight in his hand, but he let his hand fall down by his side. He returned to his nice, tranquilizing numbers. 9793238462795028841971693937510. His eyes drooped close. He felt sleep slip in and wrap its comforting arms around him. He let it take him away from a clunk followed by a shush ripped Edward from sleep. He pulled his arm from under the covers and turned on his flashlight. Its glow landed on the end of the bed. And Jack's mud-streaked smiling face! Edward screamed and screamed, continuing to scream. Edward thrashed backward in his bed, his legs kicking out. His covers got caught in his gyrating feet, and the sheet and the blanket pulled off the bed and landed in a pile on the floor. Edward's bedroom door burst open, and his mother ran into the room, her own flashlight bobbing out in front of her. "Edward?" She was out of breath. "What in the world?" In a half-second, Edward took in his mom's tangled hair, her pale makeupless face, her wrinkled nightshirt. Then he looked beyond her, trying to spot the familiar visage that he knew was attracted and attached to a robotic cat. It was no longer at the foot of the bed. Where did it go? It had to be in here someplace. He had imagined that face. It had been that horrible manufactured Jack face, and it had been staring at him staring right at him. But how? With shaking hands, Edward shined his flashlight around the room. "Edward?" his mom repeated. He worked his tongue around his mouth because his mouth was too dry to speak. "Sorry, Mom," he said finally. She rubbed her eyes. "What happened?" Edward kept shining his light around the room. He kept looking for even a hint of movement, but he saw nothing that wasn't supposed to be there. He looked at his mom. "I was sure something was in here." His mom turned in a circle, aiming her flashlight into every corner of the room. "What was in here?" she asked. I'm not sure," Edward lied. "Do I need to check under the bed for monsters?" His mom grinned at him. Edward tensed. "Was it under the..." His mom bent over and flashed her light under his bed. "Nope, no monsters. Just some of your junk and more dust bunnies than should be allowed in here." She straightened and then bent over again and picked up his covers, setting down her flashlight. She arranged the covers on the bed. Edward realized he was still crouched by his headboard. He made himself stretch out his legs, and he slid them under the sheet and blanket. His mom sat on the bed next to him. "It's a storm. It messed with my sleep a little, too." Edward nodded. "Come on, let's get you tucked back in," his mom said. He let her baby him, and he could feel himself trembling, and he hoped she didn't notice. Gosh dang it, I hate coughing during recordings. The storm moved on to torment a different town just before dawn. Edward was awake to listen to it withdraw. He was awake all night. For reasons he didn't understand, he never heard another odd sound after his mom returned to bed, and he hadn't seen Jack's face any more that night. Where had it gone? He'd spent the better part of the night trying to figure out whether he'd imagined the dirty, stiff white face of his friend at the end of his bed. No, that wasn't true. What he'd been doing was trying to convince himself that he hadn't seen it. That had been some weird trick of the light, a misinterpretation, his brain turning a lump in the covers into Jack features. But he knew he was deluding himself. He'd seen what he'd seen. Jack's face had been looking right at him. It wasn't something that looked like anything else, but Edward sure wished it was. After that night, he began seeing the horrid Jack face everywhere. The first time Edward saw the Jack face again, he was getting off the bus at the end of the day after the storm. Apparently his classmates had stopped feeling sorry for him, and now they were mad at him for suggesting Schroeder's cat as a paper topic. Pausing to flick off a spitball that hit him just as he went down the bus steps, his gaze landed on the yellow mums that surrounded Mrs. Phillips' baseball cap-wearing gnomes. Her gnomes wore the caps starting in September until the World Series was over. Edward was shrugging into his backpack when he saw the face. It was right where he and Jack had found Faraday, and it was peering up at Edward from under a low-hanging rhododendron branch. Edward gasped and stared. Then he blurted, "What do you want?" What do I want? Mrs. Phillips asked. Edward jumped and looked up at Mrs. Phillips' walkway. A magical weed dispenser, Mrs. Phillips said. Do you have one of those? The widow was kneeling at the edge of her walkway, pulling weeds. Long gray hair spilled over her hunched shoulders. She wore a bright fuchsia running suit and purple tennis shoes. Oh, hi, Mrs. Phillips. I didn't see you there. She frowned at him, brushing dirty fingers across her tan-lined face. Then who are you talking to? Huh? Edward flicked his gaze back to the flower bed. Jack's face was gone. He looked again at Mrs. Phillips. Oh, I was just practicing lines for a school play. Mrs. Phillips smiled. Good for you. I wish you luck with that. She returned to her weeding, and Edward waved goodbye and turned to continue down the street. As he walked, he scanned his surroundings. Where had the friendly face gone? Or more important, had he really seen it again? Before he left school that morning, Edward had considered going out into the yard to see if the thing was still buried there, but there was no way to do it without his mom knowing about it. She left for work right when he left to catch the bus. Now he wasn't sure if he wanted to know if the jack-faced cat was still in the hole. If it was, that meant... what? That he was losing his mind? Or that the nasty thing had the ability to dig itself out and rebury itself just to torment him? It's all infinite possibility, Jack's voice whispered into his mind. Unfortunately, Edward wasn't a fan of duality right now. It suggested far too many alarming options. Edward hurried up the sidewalk, in dizzying contrast to yesterday and the previous night. Today was mild and sunny. Several people in the neighborhood were out cleaning up debris from the storm. A lot of branches had come down. Leaves and twigs were everywhere. Edward heard at least 3 leaf blowers and 1 lawnmower. The air smelled like mulch. Just before Edward got to his own walkway, he caught a glimpse of something white out of the corner of his eye. Turning, he was sure he saw the jack-faced cat trot around behind his neighbor's house. Edward stared. Should he go after it? He felt his legs start to shake. Well, there was his answer. He was too much of a coward to go after the thing. And what? Confront it? Destroy it? He had no idea what to do, so he'd do nothing. Edward ran up his walkway, scrabbled at the lock on his front door, and dashed inside. He slammed the door behind him, leaning against it. He took several deep breaths. Should he go into the backyard and dig? He had to. Heading to the door before he could change his mind, Edward went out into his backyard and looked at the spot where he buried the jack-faced cat. The mound was flattened down, but the rain could have done that. Given that a small puddle had collected on the top where the mound had been, that was likely other than the puddle. The area looked just the way Edward had left it. Edward? Edward spun around. His mom stood on the back deck. What are you doing? She called. Oh, just checking for, storm damage. Good thinking. That's why I came home early. Want to help me do a little yard cleanup? So much for digging up the hole. Edward couldn't help but notice he felt relieved. Sure, he said. He turned his back on the friendly face's burial spot and walked toward his mom. By the time Edward went to bed that evening, he was too tired to even care what the friendly face was doing. And the next day, the kids at school were so derisive, he began to think it might be nice to have the friendly face around after all. Maybe the freakish robot was the only friend he could hope to have. But no, he didn't want the thing as a friend. He didn't want it at all. Which was why, by the end of the week, Edward was a fidgety mass of overreactive nerves. It didn't seem to matter what he wanted. He kept seeing the jack-faced cat everywhere, or at least he thought he did. When Edward and Jack had been in junior high school, they'd ferreted out all the good, secluded spots in the building, places they could hang out without encountering other kids. They'd often talked about how their first task as freshmen would be to find those sort of places in the high school. Well, Jack wasn't here to help, but Edward still went looking for seclusion, and he found it in an old, unused supply closet, under a back stairway, in a hidden courtyard, behind the teacher's lounge, behind a section of collapsed bleachers in the gym. But every place he found, the jack-faced cat found too. He only got to use each of his reclusive spots once before he spotted the face peering at him from the deepest shadows of the hidden areas. Twice he was sure he saw the friendly face hunched under the bushes near the school's entrance, tucked among the leaves, just out of view of the casual passerby. At home, he spotted Jack's face in the bushes and plants in his yard, poking up through the hydrangeas outside the kitchen window, peering past the boxwood hedge outside the living room window, and lurking in the branches of the drooping forsythia bush under his own window. And the sounds he heard the night of the storm. Now he heard them everywhere. Chittering, ticking, bizarre, pneumatic pattering sounds. He heard those all the time now in his hiding places at school, in his house. He heard the strange, sibilant pitter-patter outside his door every night this week. Granted, he never opened his door to see just what was out there, but he'd slept with all his lights on. He'd wait until his mom went to sleep, and he'd turn on his brass lamp. The first night, he didn't sleep well with all that light. The next night, though, he went right to sleep, probably because he was so exhausted from the 2 nights of practically no sleep. Now it was Friday, 4 days since the storm, and Edward still hadn't gone out to dig up the jack-faced cat's grave. 2 days after the storm, it had started raining again, and it hadn't stopped until today. The sun came out at noon, while Edward ate his peanut butter sandwich by himself next to a window in the school cafeteria. It was then that he decided he had to check the hole when he got home. If the friendly face was still there, he might have to ask his mom to take him for an MRI. Maybe he had a tumor, or maybe he was going crazy. Maybe he imagined the whole friendly face thing from start to finish. The very concept seemed outlandish to him, even now. After school, Edward was running late when he trotted toward the bus. He had enough time, but he wouldn't be able to pick the seat the way he wanted to. There were certain kids he never wanted to sit beside, kids who liked to torture him more than others. He was late because he'd gone into the deserted restroom after his last class. While washing his hands, he'd glanced in the mirror and spotted the jack face looking over his shoulder at him. But when he'd wheeled around, there was nothing there. He thought he heard a pattering behind a vent cover that looked askew, and he was debating whether he should check it when 3 other boys had burst into the restroom. Edward had been forced to run before they tried to stick his head in the toilet. Now, Edward was just a few feet from the bus when Eddie, one of the particularly obnoxious guys in his class, deliberately bumped into him. Edward staggered and almost fell. He was close enough to the bus to put out a hand and catch himself. When he did, he got a glimpse of the jack face peeking out at him from behind the bus's back fender. It was clinging to the emergency exit, hidden between Edward's bus and the bus behind, down low where no one except Edward could see it. It was on his bus. Edward backed away. He was bumped again, this time by Julia. "Watch where you're going," she snapped at him. "Sorry." He didn't even look at her pretty wavy hair. As he continued to backpedal, the buses in front of Edward started to roll forward. "Coming?" the bus driver called from the inside. Edward looked at the wheel where he'd seen the jack face. I think that's another typo. He thought he saw movement, but he wasn't sure. "No, I forgot something. I'll walk." "Thanks." Don shrugged and closed the bus door. The bus pulled out. Edward stared after it, but didn't see anything except kids through any of the windows. After the buses were gone, Edward sighed. He'd just let his paranoia force him into a 6-mile walk. Brilliant, sighing again. Edward settled his backpack more comfortably on his shoulders and started walking down the school driveway. The road that led from the school back into town didn't have any sidewalks, just a narrow gravel verge that was snug up against the massive tree trunks lining the road. Along the verge, ferns and other low-growing underbrush created a green, shaggy carpet that extended into the dusky depths of the forest. Here and there, the shaggy carpet gave way to beds of fallen fir needles. These were the paths that a lot of kids used to head into the woods. Not Edward. He would stay out here on the road, thank you very much. A few cars motored past Edward. One of them honked its horn. He had no idea who was in it. He coughed on the gas fumes that lingered in the wake of the last car. He turned to look behind to see if more cars were coming. He froze. No cars were coming up the road, but something was. It was the friendly face. It was right there, clear as could be, no mistaking it for anything else. This wasn't one of those fleeting glimpses. This wasn't just a peek of the pale Jack face. This was the honest to goodness, real friendly face. The black cat, its fur now matted and muddy, possibly from being buried and digging itself out, and the haunting Jack features with the unyielding smile. The jack-faced cat was skipping along the edge of the road, gamboling happily after Edward, as if they were playing a game of follow the leader. Edward didn't stop to think. He just ran. At first, he ran down the road, but when he checked over his shoulder, he could see that the Jack face was getting closer. There was no way he could outrun an animatronic on a flat, open road. He had no choice if he wanted to get away. He veered to his left. In between two towering trees, Edward scraped his shoulder against the bark of the second tree, but he kept running. He leaned over a scrubby bush, and he trampled a cluster of ferns. He didn't take time to look behind him again. He just fell pell-mell through the damp and dingy woods. A few hundred feet into the trees, Edward reached a creek. He didn't slow down. He splashed across it. He raced up the incline on the other side of the creek, slipping when his feet encountered a pile of river rocks. Windmilling his arms to get his balance, Edward turned, intending to run along the flat part of the terrain here, instead of having to climb any higher up from the creek. But a splash made him check back behind him again. The cat thing was capering along in Edward's wake. Its tail was up in the air as if it was having the time of its life. Life? It had no life. It wasn't alive. It was a thing. Edward wasn't fooled by the thing's happy expression. The smile was too set, too hard to suggest any good feelings, given that the jack-faced cat was functioning, moving, maybe even, God forbid, thinking. It was fair to say it was alive, at least in a robotic way. That meant when he put it in the hole and covered it with dirt, he buried it alive. Was it angry? What would it do when it reached him? Edward squeaked in panic and turned to run again. Scrambling up a slippery bank, he fell to his knees and clawed his way to the top. Realizing that his backpack was slowing him down, Edward shrugged out of it, and he managed to get back on his feet. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he ordered his legs to keep going, to run. Hard. It had been stupid to run into the forest. He'd been better off on the road, where there were other people, where someone might be able to pull over and help him. He tried to think it through while he ran, tried to discern whether he was still being followed. At first, all he could hear were his own footfalls and labored breathing, but then he heard the ticking and the pneumatic-sounding patter. His throat tightened. Frenzied, he plowed his way through a dense thicket of some greenery he didn't recognize and found the creek again. It had curled around. He figured if he recrossed it, he'd end up back at the road eventually. Could he stay out in front of the jack-faced cat long enough to get there? He risked a glance over his shoulder. "Go away!" he screeched when he saw the thing frisking along merrily, bouncing and hopping playfully in the furrows Edward's feet left in the undergrowth. He put his back to Jack's face and stumbled toward the creek again. When he reached it, he leaped across its deepest part. His foot landed on a rock, and his ankle twisted. He cried out, but he didn't go down. Tears filled his eyes as he kept running, ignoring the throbbing pain. He wasn't sure how long he ran after he crossed the creek. It felt like he was running in circles. Was that the same tree he'd just passed? How could he tell? They all looked alike. He didn't look back again. The occasional tick-tick-tick was enough to let him know his pursuer was still after him. The pain in his ankle got worse every time his foot pounded the ground. His legs started feeling weak. He could hear rails in his lungs. He felt his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. He was beginning to think he was going to run himself into death from exhaustion when he noticed light creeping in between the trees ahead. He thought he heard the rush of an engine going past on the road. He was almost there. He tried to run faster, but he was so tired, his steps faltered. Something touched Edward's ankle. He glanced down. The jack face smiled up at him. Edward screamed, put his head down, and pumped his arms to push his body even faster. Just a few more steps. He sprinted hard. his gaze firmly on the ground in front of him so he wouldn't trip over something and go down. He couldn't see clearly, though. Everything was blurry, probably because his eyes were filled with tears and sweat. It didn't matter. He kept running. He bolted forward, pelting away from the thing behind him, hurtling toward what he hoped was. Edward felt a flash of pain so intense that it couldn't possibly have been real. The pain was the last thing he felt. That the pain was incomprehensible was the last thing he thought. He had he never even had a chance to think sorry. The semi-truck that hit Edward started skidding right after the impact. The driver, his eyes bulging, his heart racing, his stomach suddenly in a billowy knot, practically stood on the truck's brake pedal. Of course, it was too late. The semi-truck kept going for several yards before jackknifing to a stop. While behind the truck, Edward's body lay in the road, a pool of blood widening around it. A few feet away, partially hidden in the ferns at the edge of the verge, the friendly face hunkered down. It flicked its robotic tail. Its smiling jack face kept its gaze sincerely focused on Edward's still form. It would wait now. It would wait patiently for Edward to get back up so they could play some more.